At this time, I'll call to order the Budget and Finance Committee. Governor Kuntz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize to our members for our tardy start. The previous committee ran over.
It's only my second time. Working on it.
Minoka, could you call the roll, please?
All right. Chair Kuntz.
Here.
Vice Chair Lautenbach.
Here.
Governor Beard. Chair Colson.
Here.
Governor Fossey. Governor Huizenga.
Present.
Governor Levine.
Here.
Governor Rude. And Governor Tripp.
Here.
Chair Kuntz, you have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a lot on the agenda, and in the limited time that's been allocated to us, we'll try to get through it on time. The first order of business is to approve the minutes from the meeting of June 20th.
So moved.
Second.
Any changes? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Okay, thank you. The next order of business is we have several regulations that are being amended, and I'm going to ask Tim to go over each one of them, identify the changes being made, and I think we can approve them all as one. So, Tim, if you want to take us through the, I think, 4 changes that are being made.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll direct the committee to your agenda material. We'll start with Regulation 7.001, tuition and associated fees. It's on page 117 of your packet. We have several changes that we're requesting. First, we're eliminating the specific amount that we have identified for undergraduate tuition and are going to refer to the statute and the General Appropriations Act. We're also eliminating the reference to the building fee. As Chris mentioned, this was eliminated by statute last year, so we're just conforming our reg to current statutory authority. We've also eliminated the language regarding college preparatory courses. This was a change during last session as well. And we're eliminating the due date for block tuition in the regs, so we'll just set that at the Chancellor's office. And finally, we're modifying the date the tuition differential report is due to the legislature. There was changes in legislation this past session that moved that back 1 month. So the next regulation is 7.003, fees, fines, and penalties. This is on page 128 of your packet. This committee has changed the due date in which we take up increases in fees and new fees from January, February to June. So this modifies our regulation to conform with practice. We're also clarifying the excess hour fee applies to first-time in college students. So that's a clarification for our institutions. Next, we have Regulation 7.008, the waiver of tuition and fees. That can be found on page 139. This is being amended to clarify the number of credit hours that may be waived for students classified as homeless. So this has been an issue on our campuses, so this will hopefully provide some additional clarification for them as they implement that statutory provision. Next, we have Regulation 9.007, State University Operating Budgets. This can be found on page 147 of your packet. We have several changes to this regulation. We're adding clarifying language on the use of carry-forward funds being included in our annual expenditure analysis reports. Also, that the education general funds are used for operating activities only unless specified by unless something is different specified in law. We've also added language requiring universities to comply with federal, state, and local laws when implementing grants, contracts, and sponsored research programs. That's an inclusion really at the request of the Auditor General when they came in and did our management audit last spring. We've added language regarding the inclusion of technology fees and operating budgets, and clarifying language about interest earnings from E&G funds being used for E&G purposes. So, Mr. Chair, those are the changes for the 4 regulations that are being proposed.
Okay, thank you, Tim. These are amendments to existing regulations. Just as a reminder that This is a two-step process, so assuming we approve these amended regulations for notice, it will be available for public comment for a period of 30 days, and then the board, we would approve the final regulation at our November meeting. Are there any questions about any of these mostly technical changes to these four regulations? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve?
I'll move it.
Second. Second. Any further conversation? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Now, next item is item 4. This is a new regulation that will be proposed. And Tim, would you please take us through that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Regulation 9.014, Collegiate License Plate Revenues. Statute requires the board to approve expenditure plans for universities' use of those revenues. This goes back to the days of the Board of Regents where they approved the initial expenditure plans. We've had 2 universities come forward in the last year asking for modifications to those approved plans, so we felt like we need to get a regulation on the books kind of governing those submissions. So the regulation identifies the current approved expenditure plans by institution and provides them with ability to modify their expenditure plan up to 10% without having to come back to the board for approval. Anything beyond 10%, they would need to get this board's approval. So it gives them a little more flexibility and maybe keep some of the minutia off the committee's agenda.
Okay, thank you. Is there any questions on this? And again, this also would fall into the two-step process, so we'd have the final approval in November. Any questions for Tim? Is there a motion?
I'll move it.
Second. Any other questions? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Item 5 is the 2013 and 14 operating budgets, both for the system and for the board general office. Tim, can you give us an overview of that? I think you have a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, I just have a couple of slides for the committee. The operating budgets are required to be submitted to the board pursuant to Regulation 9.007. As you know, the boards of trustees are responsible for the day-to-day management of their budget. What staff does is look at the budget that's submitted and make sure it's in accordance with state statute and board regulations. And we have done that and don't have any issues with what's been submitted. This is just an overview on the entire system operating budget for 13-14. As you can see, we are a very large enterprise, over $11 billion in revenue estimated for this current year. What's in green is the education and general component of the operating budget that really impacts the instruction of our students. And this is what we'll be talking about later in terms of the LBR request that the legislature will deal with next session. So about 34% of our budget goes to instruction of our students, with the other pieces of the pie going really to support the operations of the university through contracts and grants, various local funds, auxiliaries such as your housing and your transportation. So just kind of the magnitude of the impact that the system has on the state of Florida through the economy is very significant. And you'll recall the economic development study we did about a year ago, in which we provided over $88 billion in economic impact to the state. And finally, Mr. Chair, we have the board general office operating budget of $6.5 million, of which majority is to fund the salaries and benefits of 57 authorized positions, and the rest goes to support the activities of this board and staff. So that's a quick overview of the operating budgets.
So really what we're doing is two different things. One is we would be approving that we have reviewed each university's plan and that you have, and then separately that we've looked at the board plan as well, correct?
That's correct, because in your packet, there is an operating budget for each institution, so you can take those up as one motion, and then the board office would be separate with authority to the chancellor to make technical changes as necessary to get us through the year in terms of operating dollars.
I have a question, but I'll ask others first. If any questions you might have? Just a quick one, Tim, on the board office, just to maybe have it on the record. Are there any material differences in this budget compared to the previous budget, or is it more business as usual?
It's business as usual. The only thing that may be a little bit different is with the addition of staff that we had this year, we had 5 new positions provided. We had to reconfigure, if you're familiar with their offices, the 16th floor of the Turlington building, we had to reconfigure one end of the hallway, which cost some money to do that. If we would get positions in the future, we need to configure the other end of the hallway, so we have budgeted money to do some renovations in anticipation of additional staff in the future. That would be the only real difference between prior year budgets.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I
Sir,
don't
Governor
have a
Huizenga.
question, but just a statement. I'd like to recognize the job, the incredible yeoman's job that the staff does of 57. We were privy to some numbers of other large university systems. We're number 2. California has over 1,200 members on their board. We are doing ours with 57, and I think they do an exceptional job, so I'd just like to recognize that. As we talk about adding 5 positions, we could add 500 and still be a lot less than many of the university systems. Not that I'm advocating that we do that, but I just want to recognize the incredible job that our staff does do.
Good thing.
Thank you, Governor, and I agree. So,
I would like to add on to
Yes, sir.
that, too.
thank you, Governor.
Recognize that.
So at this time, first is, can I have a motion to approve the 2013-14 university operating budgets?
So that,
Motion, is there a second? Is there a second? Any other questions, conversation? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign, motion carries. Second, can I have a motion to approve the budget for the 2013-14 operating budget for the board office?
So moved.
Motion second. Any further conversations? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Okay, thank you. Now, this next part is something that we've all been working hard on, especially the staff, working with the staffs of each of the universities. And we're going to have several conversations about performance-based funding, and it's easy to get them mixed up a little bit, and so there's really 2 different conversations. One is the legislature allocated, and the governor signed an allocation of $20 million to be awarded to the universities based on 3 performance metrics. Separately, we'll have a conversation going forward on really what we've been talking about for the past 3 or 4 meetings, which is a performance-based funding conversation where we will talk about 10 metrics. But for the first part of the conversation, we need to talk about the $20 million that's been allocated to us. We are required to come up with a methodology to allocate this money, and we have to do that at this meeting. This will also result in actually approving how that allocation is going to occur. We posted yesterday on the website, the Board of Governors website, the proposed funding dollars as well as the process. And I guess maybe just my comments first, and then I'll turn it over to Tim and Jan to walk us through. We're having to deal with, instead of the 10 metrics that we'll talk about going forward, we are required to only look at 3 metrics. That's the way the legislation was approved, and so therefore that's what we have to do. We're not allowed to editorialize and say, well, those are 3 really great metrics, but we kind of like our 10, so we'll use the 10. We are using the 3, and not that those are not good metrics, but it's important to remember we've never done this before. The metrics we're using, there are unintended consequences to when you have a limited number of metrics you're looking at, and we've never looked at them before in this way. So we have a process that I personally believe we have to be a bit cautious with, that we don't assume that this is a perfect process. We haven't done it before, and we're going to learn as we go. I think it's great that we're moving towards more of a performance funding thought process and way to do business, but I think we also have to be careful, and as we're jumping into this pool, we'll get in the shallow end first. It's also important to remember the $20 million is not coming out of the university's base funding allocation, but it's actually additional money on top of the base funding. So how we do this, it's all additional money to what we would have had in our normal budgets, and so I'd call that a good day. And as you'll hear as we go through, as we work through the three metrics and then how staff has proposed we allocate the money, every university receives, in this proposed allocation, receives some money, but there is a difference, a fairly wide difference from the high to the low. I'd also acknowledge up front that this is just one way to do it. Everybody has opinions. Everybody's opinions, as I have learned over the past week or so from the universities, each of those opinions would tend to create a system which just coincidentally would result in each university who was talking to me, their allocation being the largest. There's lots of ways to do this. Eventually, we just have to pick a way to do it, but I would ask us to remember this is in addition to our base allocation of funds, and that it's the first time we've done it, and so we're trying to be a little bit cautious and not have one or two schools end up with all the money and the rest of the universities end up with none, given that it's not a perfect science, probably never will be a perfect science, but I think we're pretty far away from it being a perfect science at this point. So with those comments and caveats, Tim and Jan, if you would maybe take a few minutes. This is important because when we get into the second part of the conversation, when we talk about the 10 metrics and the legislative budget requests that we're going to make over time, this performance-based funding, not the $20 million isn't a lot of money, because it is, but it will hopefully turn into an even much bigger amount, and so this is a good first test as we wade into this performance-based funding pool. And so why don't we just let you and Jan walk us through, and then we'll see what kind of questions the committee has.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll refer the committee to page 192 of your packet, where we have defined...
192?
192, yes. This is where we have defined the three metrics that have been identified in legislation. The first of those metrics is the percent of bachelor's graduates employed and or continuing their education. We have worked very hard on obtaining the data for this metric. There is some shortcomings in that data for students who are employed out of state is not available. We would like to include that data because we look at our students as being global in nature, getting jobs all over the country. Although we'd prefer them to stay in Florida and do great work here, we have to recognize that our system is sending students out into the world to do great things. So for the time being, the data included for this metric will be focused on employment data of students who are in Florida, and hopefully in the future we can get employment data for students who are located outside of Florida. We are able to track the students who are continuing their education in Florida and or I guess continuing their education outside of Florida, so that data set is fairly complete. Metric number 2 is the average wage of full-time employed baccalaureate graduates in Florida 1 year after graduation. And we picked 1 year after graduation because many of our students set for professional licensure exams, so whether it's the bar or CPA, so you want them to get time to get through those exams and then look at their employment data 1 year out. So using the unemployment insurance wage data, we are able to determine the average wage of a Florida graduate, but it does not include, it has some shortcomings. It does not include individuals who are self-employed, who are employed out of state, employed by the military or federal government, and it does not include students who have invalid Social Security numbers or making less than minimum wage. So those are some caveats associated with the data on metric number 2. Metric number 3 is the cost per undergraduate degree to the institution. We looked at our annual expenditure analysis, which has been in existence since the 70s, and we know there are shortcomings with our expenditure analysis, but it is the only thing that we have in terms of measuring expenditures at the different levels. So we looked at undergraduate expenditures per credit hour over the last 4 years. Assuming a student would graduate in 4 years, you can get a rough estimate of what it's costing the institution to provide an education for that student. So that's how we have defined those 3 metrics. Now on page 194 of your packet is an example on how the methodology would work, and as Governor Coons said, we did post the real numbers to the website yesterday. Since this is the first time we have looked at the data for these 3 metrics, we're only setting up benchmarks for what the metrics are now. We don't have any improvement data, as we're going to talk about in our 10-metric model, where we're looking at excellence and improvement. Here we only have 1 set of data, but going forward, this will be the benchmark to measure against future improvement. So what you can see on page 194 is a listing of the institutions going down the left-hand side, the 3 metrics, and a benchmark set for each metric. Once again, not having done this before, we established a point system similar to the 10-metric model we've been working on. You can earn 1, 2, or 3 points depending on how your data looks. We set point number 2 as the system average. So once we had the data, we looked at the system average, and if you're roughly at the system average, you get 2 points. Then we set a benchmark below it and 1 above it to get either 3 points or 1 point. And it's entirely possible that an institution may not get any points for a metric. So in the example, you can see how the calculation is done. So I'll move to what was actually posted yesterday on our website. The total scoring and looking at the institution range from 1 point to 6 points. Now, the most you could get on the model would be 9 points. So there is a little bit of variance. So obviously, if you perform better in these areas, the more points you get, the more funding you would get. So those 1 to 6 points provides a range of $434,000 for New College to $2.6 million for USF and UCF. So that's kind of the range of the allocation. So that's kind of a quick overview, Mr. Chair, of the definitions and the methodology.
Thanks, Tim. A couple points. If you look at what was posted on the website, just to state again, we have to use these metrics. You could come up with lots of things. If you look at the high and the low on metric 1, New College is 49% in metric 1, percent of bachelor graduates employed and are continuing their education 1 year after graduation. And University of North Florida is the high at 71%. It's a huge difference. On metric 2, FAMU is the low at $28,864. Florida International is the high at $35,264. Well, you could say, well, maybe the wage scale in South Florida is higher. That would be a logical thing to say, and that's probably true. That's not something that the legislation said you can take into consideration. It was just a matter of fact. What is the average full-time wages? The third metric, the UCF has the lowest cost per undergraduate degree of $20,281, and New College has the highest of $74,832. And as you go through, and Tim mentioned the answer sheet, which probably all of the presidents or your staff have at least looked at since it was posted last night. As you said, New College is at $434,783, so it works out, you get $434,783 per point that the university achieves. So they had 1 point, and University of South Florida and UCF have 6, and the rest, Florida and A&M had 2 points, Florida Atlantic 4, Florida Gulf Coast 5, FIU 5, Florida State 5, New College 1, UCF 6, University of Florida 4, University of North Florida 5, University of South Florida 6, and University of West Florida 3. So that's the way it scores out. I'm a little worried about this in the sense of, that's why we like the 10 metric process, because we're going to end up with a better way to look at, in my opinion, true performance. And so what we're hoping is that this 3 metric exercise, that this is the only time we would actually do this, because what we're hoping is going forward, the legislature will look at our 10 metric suggestion, which all of us have worked on, and incorporate that. So that's the way it looks now, and I think at this point I'd like to open it up to any committee member questions or comments. Yes, sir.
I want
Governor Levine.
Please, I want to first of all commend you, Chairman, because I think this was a difficult task and the staff had a tough job to do here. There's kind of likening this to the field I'm in healthcare, where the government years ago set out to develop pay for performance. It wasn't something you could pull a trigger and do in 1 year. It took multiple years to get to a place where you started using financial incentives and even punishment in our field for poor performance, high readmissions, high mortality, things like that. And so I think it's important to reiterate what you said, and I'm glad you said it, that this is a work in progress and something that's going to continue. As I looked at this data, there's a couple ways you could look at it. If you look at metric 1, percent of bachelor's employed and or continuing education after 1 year, I mean, on the one hand, it could be, if you score low, you're creating a lot of baccalaureate degrees that are not employable, which is sort of the point of the metric, or you might be rewarding a university that has a low graduation percentage, and so we don't know yet which is happening. And I think it's important, I think personally, to recognize when you have major research universities that are aspiring to have national reputations like University of Florida, Florida State, USF, and UCF, you're looking and you're producing high STEM degrees, which have higher cost. You're going to penalize those who have a higher cost of degree for those when you look at the aggregate. And I think the reason I'm saying this is I understand from university presidents that I've spoken with that these are concerns, but I also appreciate the fact that y'all went to such great efforts to stick to what the legislation said and to not presume that we had the authority to veer from what they said. But I do think we need to work with the presidents to adjust towards our towards our 10 metrics and have a longer-term outlook for where we want to be in 5 years. And I think when we do that, we're all doing it together with everybody agreeing on where we're going. And so I just want to thank you for that, and I'm going to support this today, knowing that our plan is to modify it going forward.
Thank you, Governor. I agree with your comments on how we need to move forward. Any other comments, questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I just want a clarification that and we've been talking about performance funding for a long time, and we've been telling our presidents the performance funding is becoming a major deal for us. That said, this has to go back to the legislators and for them to change the 3 item to 10 and become law for us to be able to consider those 10 items.
Correct. I mean, we can only do with what they give us, and so while we've had discussions with the legislature, and I think we've made a lot of progress in helping all of us understand that performance-based funding is where we're going, it is the future, but also understanding the merits of our 10-metric system, which we'll talk about in our next agenda item, and assuming you all agree, the more we can talk to the legislature about moving to those 10 metrics, I think the better.
But we do have support, on on the side of the legislators and to your hard work, and working with the governor's office.
Yeah.
I think we have overall support. It just has to go through the system to get it.
Exactly.
And Mr. Chair, may I?
Yes, sir.
Just point of clarification, Vicki, you tell me if I'm wrong. There's two approaches the legislature could take. One is to codify in law ultimately the entire performance-based formula. The other approach would be to, in law, delegate authority to the Board of Governors to design and implement a system of performance-based funding where that money would go. Is that fair?
So you are correct.
It is correct,
Yeah.
okay. And the reason I mention that, it's like six, one half dozen the other, but in my view, rather than end up, I'm exactly like Governor Levine, and I've watched around the country. Whatever formula we put in place from day one will not be exactly the same formula, perhaps even in year two, because as you flush out these systems, you're going to make adjustments, and it is much easier to make an adjustment here at this table than it is in the halls of the Capitol. So if the legislature is willing to give that kind of authority, because I also agree with Governor Hussaini. I can't find anybody in the House and Senate Governor's office who doesn't agree with performance-based funding, but the methodology on it, I think, is important, and I think as we move forward, we really want to consider that with the evolution of this thing over time, it's probably better to have the flexibility to make those changes without having to change statute every time you do.
I agree. And we'll talk more about that in our next agenda item. For this time, they have restricted us to these three items.
Correct.
Yes, Governor.
Thank you, Chairman Coons. At first, I was a little reluctant to support the methodology and the benchmarks in which which are presented here, considering that 10 of the 11 institutions are receiving roughly in the amount of $3.75 of $1 million separately. However, after hearing the comments made yesterday during our retreat and reviewing this with the Chancellor and you, Mr. Chairman, I do think the three metrics that were given to us, this is really what we can do with this, and I just hope that we're proactive this upcoming legislative session to improve what methodology and what metrics we can base our performance funding model around. I hope that the legislature grants us additional authority, additional allocation to distribute to the universities, and they give us the flexibility to really govern the system and choose what benchmarks and what methods we should distribute the performance-based funding in an effort to conform with the intent of what the legislature and the governor are proposing here for our state university system. So I will be voting yes.
Thank you, Governor. Any other questions? Yes, sir, Governor Tripp.
Just a comment that as we go forward in the legislative process, history shows us that we really ought to try, as a group, get some agreement on the metrics that we want to see come out of it, because we know when we go to the legislative session, every day we see presidents and trustees from each university talking with legislators, and if we present a front that shows that maybe we're not in agreement, that we're all trying to negotiate this or that, we probably, at the end of the day, won't come away with something that we've all agreed upon. And so I think it's important, as we go forward, to do what we're doing, which is to try and find 10, to try and make sure that we have everybody's buy-in, so that as we go forward on this, we're not showing that we don't understand as a system where it is we want to get.
Thank you, Governor. I think when we get to the next agenda, and what we will talk about is that we've done a lot of that. Each of the universities have been very involved in the discussion. So on this item, other comments. So what we are required to do is approve our allocation methodology and submit that to the legislature by, I think, the end of October, Tim? Yes. So that's what we would be doing today, but effectively, we're really doing two things, because by approving the methodology, we are in fact then approving the dollar distribution, because the numbers are already, it's just math at that point. And so the reason that this was posted yesterday to the website is to make sure everybody had a chance to see it. But the motion that I'd be seeking is to approve the methodology for the distribution of the $20 million in performance-based funding, and acknowledging that in the process of doing that then the math fills in the piece of paper, and that the distribution would be in accordance with the document that was posted on the website yesterday. Does that work for you, Vicki?
Second.
There's a motion, a second. Now let's just make sure that's okay.
Yes, that would work for me, or you could move to approve the methodology and the allocation that is set forth on this document,
Yes, okay.
which is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. Okay, there is a motion and a second. Is there, that's exactly what I said. Motion and a second. Is there further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Thank you for all the hard work, and thank you to the university presidents and your staff as you've worked through with the team to come up with this. Okay, Tim, so the next item on the agenda is the legislative budget requests, and I think what you'll probably do is go through and talk about the legislative budget request, and then ultimately, as part of that, there is a performance-based funding component, and that's when we'll get into the 10-metric conversation. Does that work?
Yes, sir, that'll work perfectly.
Okay.
So before we get into the actual LBR, let's talk about where we are in terms of the state fiscal outlook. Just last week, the legislature released a draft of their 3-year financial outlook statement, which they're required to do on an annual basis. Here's a high-level summary of projected general revenue and lottery for next year. And you can see there is an upward tick in expected revenues. Now, we've already heard and we've read in the press about potential tax cuts that the governor may be supporting and maybe legislative leadership. So you don't know where you're going to end up at the end of the day during session. But at least initially, based on the most recent outlook, things are looking up. Now, in the 3-year financial outlook released last week, this is how the legislature would propose spending available GR at this moment. So they have identified about $29 million in available general revenue. They look at base budget expenditures that they have to cover. Then they look at, okay, what are critical needs or high priority needs of the state that we have to fund or must fund or really need to fund. So you have critical needs, high priority needs, and then an amount set aside for reserves. So even if you take care of all the base budget and critical and high priority needs, there's still a little bit of a balance at the end of the day. And that's been not the case the last few years. In the last few years, we've had a negative balance and we've had to have budget cuts. So once again, this is looking upwards for the state. Now, what's included in the high priority needs? And I'll go over those in just a moment. There's nothing related to the university system in the critical needs area. But in the high priority needs, we have several issues that they've identified. The Florida Virtual Campus, which we'll talk about later in our LBR. The final phase-in for the FIU and UCF medical schools. P&M funding for new facilities, IFAS workload. Those are all things that are in our LBR that the legislature would identify as high priority and that we would need to try and fund those. And they actually have included, and this kind of surprised me, an expected increase in tuition revenue looking at the last 4 years and what the average tuition increase has been of 4.43% and built that into their budget projections. So for the university system, this is what the 3-year financial outlook looks like in terms of potential support for the SUS. In the dark is the state support. The lighter color is the tuition revenue. So there's, based on those critical and high priority needs, there's a slight uptick in support for the SUS over the next 3 years. And obviously when you get to session, they hear what we're identifying in our LBR. That could change based on the amount of money that is available. So what does our LBR consist of? These next few slides, you've seen these in the past, particularly at the June work plan. We continue to grow our enrollment, so we're providing access to our students. We don't have fall of 2013 numbers yet, but indications are that you will see another uptick in enrollments. We continue to increase the number of baccalaureate degrees awarded. The percentage increase in STEM versus non-STEM is moving at a higher pace. Same way for our graduate degrees awarded. So we're getting more kids into the STEM areas. So this is what our LBR looks like for next year. You can see historically what we have received. Once again, the black is the state funds, the light colored is tuition, and how turbulent it's been in terms of the state dollars over the last several years. The big dip in 2012-13 was related to the $300 million reduction that we took, but was subsequently restored in 13-14. So this is the appropriation categories that the legislature uses when they build their budget. So this is a high level. You have the E&G core budget, which is our universities and the main campuses, looking at a little over a 2% increase for them. And then you have what we call our special units, IFAS, our health science centers, and our medical schools. So an overall increase of a little over $82 million proposed, or 2.1%. There are three other appropriation categories: the Florida Virtual Campus, which we'll talk about shortly, risk management insurance, that's a legislative initiative. They will decide whether or not that is increased or decreased. And we have student financial assistance, which every university receives funds to provide financial aid for students. We have two areas that are kind of pass-throughs for the board: the Moffitt Cancer Center and the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. Their budgets are within the overall university system budget, so we've identified these as pass-through. They're coming forward and asking for an increase in their budget. They're really the only mechanism for them to get that into the legislative process is through this board. Folks always like to look at where is our funding per student been. So this is looking over the last several years. You can see how the decline has been up until the most recent years, and a lot of this is a function of we've been increasing enrollments at the same time funding has gone down. And you can see the big dip in state funds in 12-13. Once again, that's related to the $300 million that we lost for that 1 year. So our budget is broken down into really three strategic areas: performance funding, workload or phase-in initiatives, and system initiatives. And we'll go over each one of those. So performance funding, we have four principles that we've been using as our guiding light as we work on the 10 metrics. So we're asking for $50 million that would be allocated based on those 10 approved metrics. And we'll talk a little bit more, as Governor Coons said, about the 10 metrics once we finish this discussion. Next, we have workload or phase-in initiatives, and these are the issues that we saw the legislature has included as a high priority area for the 3-year financial outlook. And these are issues that we normally ask for each year. So really what's kind of new are the research and system initiatives of $16 million. This information is in your packet on page 10, provides a summary of each of these areas, and I wanted to touch on them briefly. This is the first time we've brought forward a budget that really doesn't have any university-specific issues. So we really focused on performance funding and system needs. So this first item is a collaboration between our research universities, UF, FSU, UCF, FIU, USF, and the University of Miami. So this is an initiative that was started a few years ago when they received actually grant funding from an appropriation that the legislature provided. So what this does is provides some infrastructure so that these institutions can work on external research grants or collaborative research projects. So I think it's really great that our research institutions are working together on this. They provide them with about $1 million each to purchase whatever data storage systems they need to house data. Next, we have the Florida Virtual Campus. That was another issue that was included in the legislative 3-year financial outlook statement. This is a joint initiative with the college system. You'll recall that when the Florida Virtual Campus was established, half their budget is in the university system budget and half is in the college system budget. So this is the half that would be for the university system budget. This includes funding to upgrade advising software, to implement STEM e-resources, to do video streaming and multimedia resources. Next, we have the shared library collection and storage facility. And Chris had mentioned this during the presentation, that on our list is a funding request for a facility in Gainesville that would house a collection of libraries that all of our libraries send to one place to be held. The documents are digitized and then sent back out to the universities so all the students can use them. Since that facility is not built yet, there is a need for additional space to house those library collections. They receive about 200,000 documents a year, so that's a lot of documents that they have to provide storage for, personnel to digitize, and then send back out. So this would cover additional rent and space and some personnel for those added information. Next, we have the Florida Institute of Oceanography. This is housed at USF. This is one of our academic infrastructure support organizations, or AISOs. This has our research vessels. It does the research out in along our Gulf. You'll be hearing a presentation from FIO, I think, in the next committee meeting. They're asking for $2 million, of which $1.5 million would be one-time funds to purchase additional oceanographic or scientific equipment, and $500,000 to provide additional staffing so they spend more time out in the water doing research. Next, we have the University Press of Florida, which is housed at UF. This provides various printing services for the system, looking for $700,000 to provide an update to their inventory and asset management system. Also, they're looking at the infrastructure needed to launch e-journal project. And finally, we have SUS e-journals of almost $5 million. This covers basically the increased costs that our universities incur on major scientific research journals. Those are getting more expensive, but these are critical to our students and our researchers as they work on a lot of STEM initiatives or other research projects. So you see SUS e-journals, and I mentioned the University Press. They have an e-journal initiative, and even in the Florida Virtual Campus, they have an e-resource initiative. I know the provost met last night to talk about those to make sure there was no overlapping or duplication of requests. So I think they determined that the University Press and the SUS e-journals requests may need to come down a little bit because of possible duplication. I don't know the exact amount yet, but I would suggest we just leave these in there, and then the final budget will adjust the numbers downward. And as I mentioned earlier, we have pass-through funds requests from the Moffitt Cancer Center as they want to continue their research in cancer, in the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition, additional funds to do renovations for space that they have in Ocala and in the Panhandle, and additional researchers that they are providing to do research on the good work that they do. Something that we have normally included in our annual LBR is the Major Gift Matching Program. We last received funding for this in 2007-08. The program was actually suspended a couple of years ago. There's about $285 million in which the state has not matched yet. So we're providing this just as information. We'll have the data on file if the legislature feels like they want to incorporate this into their budget next year, but it's not a part of our official LBR submission. Now this year we received, or the university received, several projects of funding but with non-recurring dollars. So these are all listed here. These universities did submit to us a request to include in our LBR the dollars to keep these projects going in the future. We are providing them as information. We are not asking the committee to include them in the official LBR, but once again, the data is available if the legislature decides that they would like to fund these going forward. So that was a quick overview of the SUS LBR request. This is the Board General Office LBR. We're basically asking for a recurring budget. There's one reduction of $18,000. That had to do with the fact that we received 5 new positions. They give us some one-time startup money to buy new computers and so forth for those positions, so that drops out of our budget. So basically, just a continuation budget. In here, you can see historically what the office budget has been funded over the last several years. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes the overview of the 1415 LBR.
Okay, so do we need to take this up and approve this and then go into the 10 metric discussion?
Yes.
Okay, so I thought that was an excellent overview. Are there questions for Tim on what we would be submitting? Hearing none, then we seek a motion to approve.
So moved.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, so the last couple pages then get into the 10 metric conversation, and what we have to do, or what I would like to do, is we've reviewed the metrics, I think, at least 3 other times. And as I said earlier, there's been fantastic collaboration with all of the universities. So, you could take just a very short amount of time, I think, is all that's required on the first 8. But really what the conversation I think we should get to is to look at the item number 9, which is the Board of Governors choice metrics for each individual university, and see if there's consensus, we could approve that today, which would then allow the universities to go back between now and our next meeting and look at which metric you would each like to pick for the university choice metric. And so it'd just be helpful, I think, if you knew what the the 9th metric was that we're going to pick, then you have kind of all the rest of the metrics to choose from, whatever your choice might be. So, Tim?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Up on the screen is the current 10 metric model that we've been talking about. And as Governor Coons mentioned, the board needs to decide the 9th metric, but also it needs to pick for the 8th metric an additional metric for New College, because you'll see that's for master's degrees, and New College does not have master's programs. So what I direct the committee's attention to is page 338 of your packet. This lists all of the metrics that we report on in our accountability report and our work plans. The first section of that document are the 10 metrics up on the screen. Below that are the additional metrics, and staff was asked to go through the metrics to make a recommendation to the committee. So we've picked 3 metrics for each institution. We prioritize those 1, 2, and 3 on what staff felt like the committee may want to consider. So you'll see for most institutions, in the middle of the box, starting with metric number 9, percent of bachelor's degrees without excess hours is the one that we recommended for most of our universities. 1, you kind of help get the students out quicker. 2, you're really focusing on them not having excess hours, which would increase their student debt. For New College, since we have to pick 2 metrics for them, we picked the first one, which is national rankings for institutional and program enhancements. And the second one, we have recommended an institution-specific metric that they have chosen themselves in their work plans on freshmen in the top 10% of the graduating class. So you'll need to make a decision on 2 metrics for New College. And then for University of Florida and Florida State, we're recommending as the top choice faculty awards, which is number 1 underneath the common to research universities. So those are the metrics that staff has recommended, Mr. Chair, for
So in each
consideration.
area where it's ranked as number 1 is staff's recommendation. And keeping in mind the clock and the, as I said, the limited time the chair has allocated to this important discussion in committee, I also wondered, because there's been such collaboration with the universities, just wanted to see if there was any comments on this part of the process, on the selection of these metrics, that any of the university presidents wanted to ask a question about. Because we're really in this together. This is going to turn into, down the road, a really even more important part of our funding, and I would say there's a strong likelihood that the money that ultimately, years down the road, is not just going to be additional funding, but could be some of the base funding allocation, so it takes on really great importance, all these 10 metrics, and so this part is just picking our one Board of Governors metric, but wanted to see if there was any other comments that any of the university presidents would want to make.
I would just like to say that having a 10-metric system makes so much more sense to me as a university president, and I appreciate having the input into it, so I'm good.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And we will, of course, staff will continue to work with your staff as well as we
Mr. Chair,
get to the next stage.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say just that this is not only a procedural change of significance, this is an environmental change of real significance, and so it's going to require that we devote a great deal of time on an ongoing basis with the CFOs, with the provosts, clearly with the presidents and the other stakeholders in this through them. So we're going to need to work on this one a lot for a long time to make sure we always are looking for the best available outcomes.
Thank you, Chancellor. Governor Lane? Okay, yes, sir. And then
Just a brief comment. I'm still just a little bit concerned about the employment in Florida as a metric, because I think that, certainly in our case, historically, we've had some of our students who have had to go out of the South to work, and we still have a lot of connections in that vein. But on the other hand, I still think that there are kids who are graduating from FAMU who are going off to other places to work because that's where the jobs are, but they're also sending monies back home, supporting their families right here in Florida. So if you're looking at the overall impact, it's not just whether they work in Florida or not. I think it's whether or not they're employed, because I think a lot of these kids are doing a lot to support their families still.
Respond to that question if you want.
Go ahead. Governor Hosseini.
Mr. President, and we're working on that. I mean, it's a very good point. You know, we also have that issue, you know, perhaps with UF, a lot of students that go out of state. So we're working on that, you know, allow us to do some more work with the governor's office and trying to come up with the resolution of that.
Thank you, Governor. Governor Link?
Just the
No,
point
excuse me,
that...
Governor Link first.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Just a quick point that we talked in the retreat about the faculty awards, that we may need to broaden that language so that we're not recognizing one award but continuing abilities by that professor or others. So the word award may need to be broader.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be really important that staff get with University of Florida and Florida State to make sure we actually understand what it means when we say faculty awards. Now, that may be a term that everybody except me understands exactly what it means. I'm a little unclear, but we'd want to make sure that Florida State and Florida and us, that we all know what that means and it's a legitimate metric. But
President Kenshift has a question.
excuse me.
President Kenshift has a question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I would appreciate, and I think others would also, because we all care about these different metrics, that we use national data, national definitions of what faculty awards are.
Exactly.
And they are very clearly listed.
Yeah.
and we'd be happy to help with that.
Well, that's
instead
why I say, my ignorance is I just couldn't tell you what the definition is,
Right,
but there may
right,
be
but
just
there
an
are
absolute standard definition, and we know what that means.
absolute standards on...
Because we don't want to go making up our own definitions.
Exactly. Thank
Good,
you.
thank you. Now, Governor Link. Yes, ma'am.
The metric that the universities get to choose, will there be a requirement that it be, or maybe the ones you're choosing from already fit this, but will there be a requirement that it be something that's consistent with their work plans? I think, I just find it, as human nature goes, unlikely that any university is going to propose a metric where they're going to score 0 or 1 in it.
Right.
So I think, we're looking probably at 3s across the board on this one, but at least they should, I think at least should have to be consistent with something that, with their work plan.
To me, we approve the work plans, so
Right.
if they picked a metric and then the work plan was silent on it, I think that's up to us to govern the connection between the work plan and the metric.
Right, so is that going to be a requirement that their metric that they choose has to be consistent with their work plan, or is it going to be flip side, that if they chose the metric, we then have to look at their work plan to make sure it's in it?
Well, I hadn't really thought about it, so
Don't they have to choose the metric from that list?
Well, they have to choose the metric from the list, but I think your point is that if you choose the metric from the list, but the work plan doesn't talk about it.
Right, then I'm not sure that it, I just don't want it to be, every university, which I suspect, I'm concerned that it's sort of a throwaway item, honestly, because I just don't see a university submitting something that's where they're going to score low in it as their metric of choice.
I think there's just common sense to that we would require that whatever metric is picked to be discussed in the university work plans.
And will it be that they get to choose a different metric each year, or are they going to make their one choice and that they would be judged on that metric every year once they've made that choice, so that we can see whether there's improvement, not improvement, or what have you?
Defer to Tim on that, because I can't remember what...
Well, remember, our model is set up for excellence or improvement, so I would think the committee would want to have a period of time to kind of measure how they're doing on that metric. Now, the other part of this is, once you pick the metric, we still have to set the benchmark for them. So that'll probably be a negotiation process, I think, between the committee and the university. So, yeah, that metric's good, but let's set the benchmark, because that's going to be different for every university. Whereas the benchmark we have now...
that they're going to hit a home run. There has to be whatever's picked, a level of improvement that we agree on.
I just think that we should be clear whether it's something that you're going to choose the metric, and unless there's an extenuating circumstance and a reason, as we said, that this sometimes may be a living, breathing document because it has an unintended consequence. Absent that, the question is, do they get to choose one each year, or is it they're going to choose one and then that's what they're measured against every year?
I think that's a great question. I mean, my answer is no, it's not an every year choice. Now, whether it's a 3-year choice or a 5-year choice, I think that's something we'd have to decide. But I wouldn't envision it, and I don't know what staff's thought was, but I can't imagine we would want to switch every year and pick another metric.
And I just think we should just be clear on it, whatever it is.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the work plans themselves are based upon a 3-year window, if that's not correct. So it would be consistent with at least a period of time as opposed to an annual changing of the metrics.
That makes sense.
It's either 3 or 5 year change. I'd have to look.
I don't remember. President Pence.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, do you have any solution for the employment outside of Florida? We're 11 miles from Alabama.
Yeah.
11 miles. We have 30% of our students are military related. That means that we are educating a great deal of students who cannot stay in Florida. And they're getting good degrees, and it's helping their careers. How are you have a plan for dealing with that?
Yes, and I've just responded. We are working on it. We're working with the governor's office. That's where the issue is, and try to just get them to understand and try to negotiate that. Like you said, when you're training soldiers that You know,
Right.
it doesn't matter if they're in Florida, in Alabama,
Right.
you know, we're training the same, you know, people that go fight for our country, you know, they don't fight for Alabama or Florida or Georgia.
Right, that's right.
So you're absolutely right. And again, there are issues with University of Florida because a lot of the students go out of the state, and we have FAMU.
Right.
I assure you this, we will work very hard to get this resolved.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might piggyback on that, there's really two issues on this one. One is, as the governor just mentioned, the issue of the weight that you give, if you will, to those who stay in state and work and those who go out of state and work, that methodology. But the other one is our ability to track students who go out of state to work. And this is a national problem. It's very difficult to track with any degree of consistency those who leave the state. There's really only two ways to do it. One is to use self-reporting, where you follow them in survey fashion, which has obvious issues of its own, and the other is to require businesses to add that as a reporting field, and as you might imagine, they're rather loath to take on more of those kinds of responsibilities. So nationally, most of the states are trying to form consortia to be able to see, because they're all dealing with this one, to see if we can identify the best way to communicate and follow students who do leave the state for employment purposes. So we've got to get our arms around both of those issues.
Still a factor that we're being evaluated on and funding on. So
Hold on.
even though it's a terrible factor, and we don't know how to really gather information, we're still being evaluated by it.
Okay, so we had President Barron
Understood.
and then a few other governors with...
Well, I had a question related to her question.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
So Madam President, I want to make sure I understand the question, because you asked about whether we have a solution for people employed outside of Florida related. I just want to be clear about the standard as passed by the legislature. The current standard, number one, is % of bachelor's graduates employed and/or continuing their education further, irrespective of where they are.
Right.
So that you're not being penalized if they work out of state. Where the penalty possibly comes in is the average income for those that are out of state versus in state. That's the second metric, which is median full-time wages of undergraduates employed in Florida 1 year after graduation. And I just want to make sure I'm clarifying that that's where your concern was, because the first metric doesn't tie whether they're in or out.
Yeah, but you can't track, you don't have the data to track whether they're employed in another state.
And I agree with that. I mean, I think we're all agreeing on it, but I just want to make sure we weren't misunderstanding what the actual metric said, or what you were, I thought there was another penalty out there
You
that
still
I
have
was
to
not aware
track
of.
whether they're employed outside of the state of Florida.
That's right. So, okay.
President Barron?
10-4, I understand.
Okay, I hope we also commit ourselves to analyzing the heck out of the data that we get, particularly on the salary side. Because I can imagine a scenario where we would sit there and look when performance funding becomes quite large and say, now, why do I have a college of education? Because I know, looking at the statistics that are national statistics, this is one of the lowest paying starting jobs that you have. And so I have a big college of education producing a lot of teachers, and do I all of a sudden sit there and go, you know, I can get more money for my institution by shutting down my college of education and having every school run to the same corner, which then turns out to produce duplication that we're also not interested in. And if you thought about it, the best thing would be to take all of that salary data and compare education to education across institutions. Which education schools are producing, and I don't know the answer to that, are producing the most employable students at the highest salaries, rather than amalgamating it. If you look at the recent Wall Street Journal reporting on ranking institutions based on salary generation data, overwhelmingly you see both on a small liberal arts college can map as high as one of the big research universities if their focus is overwhelmingly on the business side and on the engineering side, and they skip a lot of the other degrees. And so I know we don't want to have us all run to the same corner, and I know we value teachers and other fields. And so if we get to the point where we can get more sophisticated about this instead of lumping it all in one number, then I think we won't have...
Well, and part of what you're saying, I think, is be careful of the unintended consequences of what we pick. That's why I like the 10 metrics versus the 3. It's also why this is an evolution, and we have to be careful not to just have a formula. There has to be room for some common sense judgment that we apply here when appropriate. And I think the only way to get to some of those issues is to just start going forward and seeing what issues are surfacing. But I couldn't agree with you more, because you don't want everybody to go to, try to beat the system just to get the money.
On that point, though, I
So,
thought I had is
Governor
that we
Lumley.
ought to take these 9 and soon hopefully 10 measurements and do the analysis now with the university, so that we begin to look at the data and see the results and say, wow, this doesn't make sense. So before we get all locked into the end of the job of the funding, that we have a
And I think
chance
we have 9 out of the 10 where we have data now.
Yeah,
that
the
are starting
beauty-
to do that.
The beauty of ultimately settling in on the metrics is you can start to run models.
Yeah, and then we'll know whether there's...
As the models are run, you can, those aberrations will begin to pop up, and you can
We can
begin
give
to
those
tweak
back to
the
the
model.
universities, have a dialogue, and if there's tuning needed...
And I promise you, it's not right. What we have here is not the right answer.
I just hope we could do it before we get the next batch of funding, so we get another...
And I think, Tim, you're running the models, the numbers now, and am I correct that you have the data for 9 of the 10 metrics?
Yeah, as we get the data, we're running the model to see what's falling out. So the big piece of this will be the last 2 metrics, so we can choose those, and then we'll have a
Which
better
is what
sense.
we're about to do. So let me do Governor Chopra first.
Couple of questions. I was the one yesterday who talked about the faculty awards being one of the criteria, and my question may be moot if President Machen and President Barron think that there would be their own criteria for measuring research productivity or faculty preeminence. Faculty awards criteria, while well-defined, are typically very small numbers, and I can envision a situation where another university besides these 2 can exceed that number, or where we have very little change in that number. So the improvement at these institutions for those criteria may not be as reflective of what's in there. And so I had raised the issue of other areas of faculty productivity. And so if one of the presidents or both want to just comment on whether they're comfortable with the awards per se as the criteria.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. First of all, as you seek national recognition, the flexibility you seek does not exist. There is a consensus about the national award category, and that's what Eric and I are going after. So I don't see any benefit to watering it down so that we can give more awards. The awards that count in the national circumstance are clearly defined, and that's what, if we're going to play in that game, that's what we've got to focus on.
Very well. So you're supportive of, you think there's logic in us picking that as the measure we would pick?
Absolutely. I mean, it would be ridiculous for some of the other universities who are not trying to become research intensive to do that, but as I understand, it would be one of the optional ones, right?
So it'd be the one we would be choosing for you and for Florida State, and nobody else.
Yeah.
Thank you. Governor Lynn.
Just, and I may have misunderstood President Barron's comment, but I think we have to be very careful to recognize that we do have to deal with the legislature and the governor's office and get their buy-in. And for example, if we were only to look across the disciplines and say, your example being education, which of the schools are doing the best in education, and to use an oft-cited quote from the governor about anthropology degrees, that also would say, well, if your anthropology majors were making the most, even if it was $10,000 a year, you would get a lot of points. And I don't think that we're going to get the buy-in from the legislature and the governor's office if we take it down that far, because I think we understand what they're trying to get at. And while I agree that it's not a perfect system, maybe that's where you say, well, your 10 items is going to help to flush those out, because I just don't want us to lose the momentum that we have getting with them if we're going to end up rewarding a low-level anthropology degree, for example, because the governor's office, I don't see him buying into it.
And in the interest of trying to watch the clock, I think I cut you off, Governor Chopra. You had other questions?
I was just wondering if the committee is going to recommend any weighting factors for any of these in the future? Are they equally weighted for at least the next year?
for now, they're equally weighted. That's something I suppose we could talk about. And we actually had, I think we had some conversation about that, but, you know, I think we're trying to start playing the game, and then you see as you start playing,
Refine the
changes
model.
you might want to make. So, are there other questions? Because we have to take up the matter. So what I would like to do is either, at the pleasure of the committee, either accept staff's recommendations on the 9th metric, the board metric that we'd be choosing. So for new college, we'd be choosing the 2 metrics referenced. For everybody else, 1. Florida and Florida State would be the faculty awards metric, and all other universities, the percent of bachelor's degree without excess hours. So we could either accept staff's recommendation, or if it's the pleasure of the committee, we can pick whatever metrics.
I'll move we accept the staff recommendations.
Okay, there's a motion and a second, so are there further discussion? All right, hearing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign, motion carries. So we're done with that. Now what staff will do is work with the universities, now that you know what we've chosen for our metric, between now and the November board meeting, each university would look at what metric you want to choose as the 10th metric.
I just want the board to please understand that some of us are research intensive with a very strong research profile. So we'll work on whatever is dealt to us. That's no problem. But it doesn't mean that we won't also be working on faculty awards and some of the other other measures, because we're the second largest research profile in the state of Florida.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, those 2 metrics, yours and ours, if you will, are really meant to help tease out the uniqueness of each of the institutions. We've got those common metrics, and they're common for a reason, but this gives both the board and, not or, the universities the chance to add 2 metrics. And the real intent, back to Governor Link's question, is to really try to find high priority metrics for the institution that will also help clarify the unique nature of each of the institutions at the same time.
Governor, one last question.
Thank you. I think some of us have worked through this exercise in private enterprise with our own companies. And as we go down this journey of, I think, a process that will take a considerable amount of time as we consistently and I think continually refine the metrics. I would like to suggest that the human element, that how we evaluate a system should incorporate in some respects metrics related to items such as employer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, professor satisfaction. I think we also have to be careful as we evaluate and develop metrics that they not only become insular or become internal, but they also represent boundary spanning and connectivity to the greater community that we serve. So I think as metrics are refined, any enterprise, be it a university system, be it an individual university, basically rests on the shoulders of the human excuse me, the human element, the people who every day get up and make that enterprise work. So I'd like to see something related to metrics that have to do with measuring the satisfaction, if you will, of the people and the customers, the employers, the students, as we go down this road trying to refine, I think, a very appropriate approach to breathing accountability into the system. Thank you.
Good, thank you. All right, Governor Tripp.
Quickly, the one concern that I want to make sure we do retain, because we talked about it yesterday, we can't take judgment out of this totally.
Right.
And whether it's judgment in addressing an issue like Judy had, where she can point out to us, that she's got a lot going on in Alabama, and we're not counting it. I think this board, and we all need to agree, that we have to retain some judgment, because that's why we're here. You know, we can't just become machines, and someone out there pumps in a number, and we've accepted it. So I hope that we're and I think you said yesterday we will retain that thought.
There has to be some subjective element to this, that this committee and the board have the ability to correct just some unintended consequences just clearly wrong. Now, if we did that in every decision, well, then we don't have a process.
Right.
But if we never were able to do that, well, then we're just putting something in a formula, and we could make some mistakes. And so I agree. And we're running out of time, but President Bensall.
Just something quick that follows up on this theme of the human factor. We've heard anecdotally, just something for you all to think about, is the salary after the first year after graduation is a fine benchmark. But on the other hand, some universities have graduates that start high and others start lower, but the ones in the lower end catch up quicker. I've heard that. And it might be worthwhile of having a 5-year benchmark after graduation also. The shows that will reflect their preparation and the training and education they got. It's just something to think about.
Yeah, it is. And as you can tell, there's a lot of thoughts in this issue.
Right.
There's, limitless number of metrics you could choose. Eventually, if you have 50 metrics like we have in our work plans, well, you might as well have none because you have 50. And that's why I've been holding firm on 10, because I think once you get above 10, it really becomes much less effective. And then to debate what the 10 are, eventually we just have to make a decision and go forward with it, and then refine it as we go. So, Mr. Chair, I apologize for our tardiness. I had not appropriately factored in the Chancellor's remarks in my...
And it begins. You were placed in an untenable position, Mr. Chairman.
I think that concludes the responsibilities of this committee today, so I would adjourn our committee and turn it back to you.
We're going to take what was supposed to be a 15-minute break will now be a 7-minute break. So let's get back to it as fast as we can. Thank you.